So, Earl Spencer walks confidently into the imposing halls of Westminster, carrying a battered leather portfolio that apparently contains decades of heavily sealed, highly explosive family correspondence, and within mere hours, the entire carefully constructed narrative around the royal succession has completely, violently flipped on its head. That is precisely where this sprawling story gets genuinely strange and deeply uncomfortable for the palace, because the complex timeline of how these specific documents surfaced, exactly how they got directly into parliamentary hands, and crucially, who actually wrote the damning marginal notes on them, simply does not line up with anything the royal communications team has officially acknowledged to the public. King Charles is currently facing what might realistically be the most serious, existential, institutional crisis of his entire reign. And the absolute weirdest part of this unfolding drama is that the specific documents allegedly corroborating a coordinated plot against Prince William were never, under any circumstances, supposed to leave a highly secure vault located in Northamptonshire. Let us actually walk meticulously through exactly what happened, because when you critically look at what the palace officially said versus what the hard records clearly show, the glaring contradictions start piling up incredibly fast, revealing a massive structural failure. Before we get deep into the granular details of this timeline, if you genuinely enjoy breaking down royal family drama with actual timelines, verified documents, and concrete receipts, rather than just relying on fluffy tabloid rumors, please hit subscribe to my channel so you absolutely do not miss the next vital update, as it helps the channel immensely. And honestly, this complex story is moving so incredibly fast that missing even one tiny development means losing the entire narrative thread. The very first thing that aggressively jumps out to anyone familiar with aristocratic protocols is that Earl Spencer, Princess Diana's fiercely protective younger brother, does not typically hand over highly private, sensitive family archives to state bodies without a formal, legally binding summons compelling him to do so. That is not wild speculation or a guess. That is simply how the fiercely independent Spencer family has operated for long centuries, fiercely guarding their legacy from outside interference, and the Althorp Estate Archive is widely known to be one of the absolute most carefully guarded, meticulously maintained private historical collections in the entire country. Therefore, when he calmly walked into that tense parliamentary inquiry with a worn brown leather portfolio tucked securely under his arm, the immediate burning question circulating among observers was not necessarily what explosive secrets were contained within the documents, but rather why he was bringing them forward now, and most importantly, why he was doing it entirely voluntarily. The fascinating answer that eventually emerged from reliable sources is actually significantly more interesting than the contents of the documents themselves. Highly trained detectives executing a completely separate, unrelated search warrant on a former estate secretary's modest London flat had shockingly uncovered pristine photographic copies of the highly sensitive Althorp letters hidden deep inside a locked desk drawer. The Metropolitan Police immediately seized those illicit copies and promptly notified Spencer of the breach, which urgently prompted him to bring the original master documents directly to Westminster himself to ensure their absolute authenticity was not publicly disputed or manipulated by hostile palace factions. That specific detail matters immensely because it definitively proves that the massive leak did not originate directly from Spencer himself or his current staff. Rather, someone deeply embedded inside the administrative network had already covertly copied those sensitive letters years ago, and they had been sitting like a ticking time bomb in a drawer, just waiting to be accidentally found by authorities. That realization raises a whole separate, terrifying set of questions about exactly who desperately wanted those documents discovered, and who was panicking intensely enough to foolishly leave physical evidence lying around in a London flat that could easily be raided by the police. The worn portfolio itself contained highly sensitive typewritten letters and dense estate memos dated primarily between 1995 and 2003, documents that had supposedly remained securely locked away from prying eyes inside the heavily guarded Althorpe vault for well over 2 long decades. And yet, the certified delivery receipt Spencer confidently showed to the astounded committee clerk was explicitly dated just 2 days before his unexpected appearance, prominently featuring the official Metropolitan Police Evidence Unit stamp right on it, establishing a fascinating, undeniable chain of custody that nobody can easily dispute. The confirmed chain of custody goes exactly like this. The original documents securely resided in the Althorpe vault. High-quality photographic copies were covertly made at some unknown point in the past. Those illicit copies were then carefully hidden in a former employee's London flat. The police accidentally found the copies during an unrelated raid. The police immediately notified a shocked Spencer, and finally, Spencer proactively brought the authentic originals directly to Westminster to control the narrative. That highly specific timeline absolutely does not suggest a sudden, spontaneous development or a momentary lapse in judgment. It strongly suggests that someone had been deliberately sitting on those explosive copies for many years as a form of insurance, and the random police raid simply forced the deeply buried issue violently into the open. Now, here is where the administrative web gets even more incredibly tangled and deeply concerning for the monarchy, as the recovered memos meticulously outlined aggressive administrative strategies developed by highly senior court officials specifically to manage public perception during periods of intense internal royal friction. That seemingly benign phrase, manage public perception, is doing an incredible amount of heavy lifting in these documents, as they contained formal, detailed proposals to deliberately reduce Prince William's operational budget by a staggering 20% over 3 consecutive years, starting right around 2011. The stated, official justification printed on the memos was necessary administrative restructuring to save public funds, but the hidden, malicious objective, according to highly damaging handwritten margin notes scribbled on the pages, was to deliberately restrict the young prince's public engagements and actively limit his rapidly growing independent influence across various national youth charities. When you actually look critically at what was actively implemented within the palace structure between 2011 and 2014, the records clearly show that several key, highly effective aides working directly within William's busy office experienced sudden, inexplicable budget freezes and bizarrely delayed project approvals, effectively hamstringing their operations, while other palace departments somehow maintained their massive funding entirely without interruption or scrutiny. That glaring discrepancy is not a general, institution-wide austerity measure applied fairly to everyone. That is a highly targeted, malicious resource restriction cleverly dressed up as boring fiscal responsibility to avoid detection. What elevates this entire situation from a mere historical curiosity into a full-blown constitutional crisis is the highly specific signature block sitting at the bottom of the damaging policy directive, as the authorizing co-signatures included the Queen's own private secretary and a highly senior legal advisor who officially worked under the direct, exclusive jurisdiction of the sovereign's private office. Rigid bureaucratic lines of authority within the massive palace hierarchy normally prevented cross-departmental interference of this specific aggressive nature. But when meticulous investigators carefully cross-referenced the damning signature with detailed personnel transfer logs recovered from the police raid, they made a shocking discovery. The senior legal advisor had been secretly moonlighting as an unofficial, covert liaison between Clarence House and powerful external media consultants. That specific, undeniable connection is the explosive spark that turns this from a petty, internal palace politics dispute into something vastly larger and infinitely more dangerous for the institution as a whole, proving that the aggressive policy to sideline Prince William was not a localized, petty office dispute, but rather a highly coordinated, incredibly malicious administrative strategy backed by senior figures operating across multiple royal households. And then there is the explosive revelation regarding the secret meeting, as the recovered documents explicitly reference a closed-door, highly confidential meeting held at a very private, exclusive country club in Berkshire on November the 12th, 2012. The official meeting guest list remarkably included two prominent, highly influential national newspaper editors sitting directly alongside the Royal Administrative Director, and the recovered hotel reservation receipts and detailed phone billing records definitively confirmed that the massive tab for the private dining room was paid directly using a discretionary expense account linked straight to the Clarence House Discretionary Fund. So you clearly have public palace funds being illicitly used to lavishly host powerful national newspaper editors at a highly private club. And the primary subject of that expensive meeting, according to the damning documents, was strategically discussing the future of the crown and managing the narrative around the young heirs. That is absolutely not a casual, friendly lunch between acquaintances. That is a highly coordinated operational meeting between senior palace officials and powerful media executives, completely funded through a shadowy discretionary account right at a time when William's operational budget was being systematically and unfairly reduced, creating a damning pattern of behavior that is utterly impossible for the palace to ignore or explain away. Now, the massive question everyone naturally keeps asking is exactly how King Charles could possibly have been entirely unaware of any of this aggressive maneuvering happening right under his nose, considering the private office of the sovereign is fundamentally responsible for rigorously reviewing all high-level administrative briefs before they ever reach the monarch's busy desk. Daily operations are tightly managed by the powerful private secretary and a small army of senior advisors, but the specific damaging memos outlining the ruthless strategies to restrict William's budgets between 2010 and 2014 strangely never crossed the king's desk during that entire period, meaning they were deliberately intercepted and quietly filed away by a lower-level, rogue administrative committee before ever reaching proper executive oversight. That is a massive, terrifying blind spot sitting right at the absolute center of the royal administration, and the technical explanation for exactly how the highly sensitive documents leaked without leaving a single trace of an electronic audit trail is honestly the most concerning part of the entire investigation for the palace's IT security team. The highly sensitive files were somehow accessed through an obscure external computer terminal officially registered to a completely defunct advisory board that had been formally dissolved back in 2015, revealing that someone incredibly clever used an old, unmonitored administrative backdoor to quietly siphon pristine copies of the files directly to unknown external recipients years prior, brilliantly keeping the active monitored palace servers completely clean of any illicit data transfers. That level of technical sophistication is absolutely not a simple administrative mistake. That is digital infrastructure deliberately built for long-term concealment and espionage, and the recent explosive memo that suddenly landed on Charles's desk just 3 weeks ago adds another terrifying layer to the ongoing crisis. This new memo explicitly outlined a highly controversial contingency plan to rapidly transfer certain incredibly valuable royal estate properties directly to a state-managed trust if the ongoing, aggressive parliamentary inquiry ultimately resulted in severe criminal indictments against highly placed senior household staff. The highly restricted distribution list for this explosive memo included 3 active sitting cabinet ministers right alongside the personal secretary's private, encrypted cipher, revealing that senior government ministers were secretly receiving sensitive operational updates on royal succession planning entirely behind closed doors, and crucially, the sovereign himself was completely not in the loop regarding these maneuvers. When a furious Charles immediately instructed Sir Edward to summon the powerful cabinet secretary to Windsor Castle without delay, the surprisingly calm response was that the cabinet secretary was completely already in London and could effortlessly be at the castle gates within a mere 45 minutes. A highly specific detail that strongly suggests the government was fully prepared for the angry summons long before it was even formally issued. The entire, highly orchestrated sequence feels significantly less like a chaotic, panicked crisis response from a surprised government and infinitely more like a meticulously choreographed sequence where everyone already knew their lines, while William's immediate response to the growing scandal was completely different in tone and highly aggressive in strategy. While Buckingham Palace predictably remained stubbornly silent and Clarence House completely isolated itself from the press, William's aggressive legal team immediately filed an unprecedented emergency injunction straight through the High Court of Justice that instantly froze absolutely all remaining discretionary assets and blocked all pending property transfers linked to the specific administrative network named in Spencer's explosive archive. This bold, uncompromising injunction completely bypassed the traditional, slow-moving palace arbitration channels entirely, and by filing directly through the powerful civil courts, William's ruthless legal team effectively short-circuited the frantic attempts by rogue palace officials to quietly reassign incredibly valuable estate properties before the aggressive parliamentary inquiry reached its final, damning conclusions. The highly complex decryption keys that finally allowed investigators to access the shadowy secondary offshore accounts came directly from the principal accountant, who had dramatically confessed his involvement at Scotland Yard during a grueling second round of intense police interviews, and those specific keys gave investigators direct, unfettered access to the massive digital ledger, meticulously tracking absolutely every single unauthorized transfer executed by the rogue administrative faction over the years. The newly decrypted financial data revealed a direct, undeniable financial link, seamlessly connecting the malicious succession plot memos straight to the hidden offshore accounts, proving that the massive funds used to secretly finance the highly negative media campaigns deliberately targeting William's office had been drawn straight from protected estate maintenance reserves. The massive financial embezzlement and the vicious political smear campaign were undeniably funded by the exact same illicit source, which is the specific, horrifying detail that really makes this entire situation feel significantly less like petty family drama and infinitely more like deep, institutional corruption rotting the core of the monarchy. The essential money that was explicitly supposed to be used to properly maintain historic royal estates was instead being secretly funneled into shadowy offshore accounts and then ruthlessly used to fund aggressive media campaigns deliberately designed to undermine the popularity and influence of the future king, while the exact same administrative network that corruptly managed the stolen money was also meticulously managing the false public narrative. When William's relentless legal team successfully identified 12 active, highly placed staff members still comfortably employed within the Clarence House administrative wing, even after the initial, highly publicized police raids, the personnel renewal stamps clearly showed the authorizing signatures belonged to a seemingly junior undersecretary who had been incredibly quietly reassigned to a remote regional office in Scotland just 2 days after the massive scandal broke. That frantic reshuffling proves the corrupt network was absolutely not dead, but was instead actively repositioning its key, compromised players far away from London to desperately evade the rapidly expanding scope of the aggressive judicial investigation, prompting William's immediate ruthless response to massively expand the court injunction to completely cover absolutely every single regional administrative office across the entire United Kingdom, leaving absolutely no safe harbors for the conspirators. That is a highly calculated, devastating legal countermeasure, absolutely not a reactive, emotional statement from a panicked prince. And then there is the fascinating origin of the archive itself, as Earl Spencer went deep back into the highly secure Althorp vault and pulled out aging notebooks meticulously kept by the 9th Earl Spencer, featuring handwritten labels and faded black ink dating all the way back to 1984. The fascinating notebooks contained incredibly detailed notes explicitly dated October the 12th, 1998, meticulously detailing highly secret meetings between senior royal advisors and powerful newspaper executives regarding specific public perception strategies deliberately designed for managing the image of the young princes following the death of their mother. The meticulous notes faithfully recorded highly specific dates, the exact names of all participating officials, and highly explicit step-by-step instructions on exactly how to handle probing press inquiries concerning the highly sensitive issue of estate funding divisions, while a small folded index card, tucked securely into the back cover of one specific notebook, was written in Spencer's late father's highly recognizable handwriting. The card explicitly stated that these highly specific, damaging notes had been covertly removed from a secure government filing cabinet in Whitehall during the tense autumn of 1999, specifically to protect vulnerable family members from targeted, vicious political retaliation by the palace establishment, proving that the historical documents had been deliberately preserved for decades as a vital insurance policy against future, inevitable institutional attacks. That is absolutely not a wild conspiracy theory spun by internet trolls. That is a highly documented family archive explicitly detailing exactly what was happening behind the scenes. And the final page of the crucial 1998 notebook featured a clean, deliberate horizontal tear completely across the center, leaving the bottom half of the sheet completely missing from the record. A highly resourceful Spencer meticulously checked the adjacent pages for any faint carbon transfer marks or tiny indentation impressions left behind by a heavy pen nib, carefully pressing a soft lead pencil against a blank sheet of paper and rubbing it gently across the wooden table surface directly beneath where the torn page had rested for years. Faint, ghostly outlines of letters slowly began to emerge through the dark graphite shading, and the single word clearly visible on the impression was a highly recognizable surname belonging to a powerful former Lord Chancellor who had served prominently during the late 90s, strongly suggesting the missing half of that page likely contained a highly sensitive name or explicit instruction that someone went to great lengths to completely remove from the historical record. The fact that Spencer could easily recover part of the missing information through simple graphite rubbing strongly suggests the removal was incredibly hasty and panicked, not careful or professional. While outside the gates of Buckingham Palace, the angry public responses rapidly escalated as 300 furious protesters pushed aggressively against heavy police barriers while sirens wailed in the distance. A highly visible protester hoisted a large cardboard sign demanding absolute accountability now, while three completely separate anti-monarchy groups simultaneously called for an unprecedented emergency constitutional convention to be held in Trafalgar Square, and the Labour and Liberal Democrat parties convened an urgent emergency meeting in Whitehall to seriously discuss whether to introduce a formal parliamentary motion for a massive, comprehensive review of the entire Sovereign Grant Act. Lawmakers who had previously staunchly defended traditional royal exemptions were suddenly facing incredibly intense pressure from their furious constituents to immediately vote in favor of strict, unyielding state oversight, completely fracturing the long-standing political consensus that had safely protected royal funding mechanisms for decades. Through absolutely all of this unprecedented chaos, the Buckingham Palace communications officers maintained absolute deafening silence for 72 agonizing hours, stubbornly refusing to issue even a standard, boring holding statement to calm the markets, while an internal palace memo leaked directly to the evening news shockingly revealed that senior press aides had actually been completely locked out of their own digital communication channels by direct order of the powerful Lord Chamberlain. The entire palace administrative apparatus was completely paralyzed by vicious infighting, with different warring factions offering wildly contradictory advice to the monarch, while the king's highly cautious personal medical advisors strongly recommended against him attempting a live television broadcast due to the highly unpredictable nature of the ongoing, aggressive police investigations and the massive legal risk of accidentally contradicting active, highly sensitive court proceedings. The Crown was effectively legally gagged by its own highly paid legal counselors to prevent accidentally prejudicing the pending, highly publicized criminal trials of former staff members, but that forced silence was overwhelmingly interpreted by the furious public as a clear sign of weakness and deep institutional guilt. And without a reassuring, strong voice speaking directly from the throne, the massive media vacuum was quickly filled by wild speculative reports, highly damaging leaked government memos, and aggressively hostile commentary from political opponents. The massive division between the ancient monarchy and the modern public widened dangerously with absolutely every passing hour. And then there is the explosive issue of the missing ledger entry, as a highly senior parliamentary researcher shockingly discovered that a specific financial record buried deep in the Duchy of Cornwall archives dating back to 2008 recorded a highly suspicious multi-million-pound property transaction involving a completely unregistered offshore holding company that lacked all required parliamentary disclosure signatures. The diligent researcher immediately flagged the massive anomaly and quickly forwarded the highly sensitive digital file directly to the lead investigator heading the elite financial fraud task force at Scotland Yard, meaning the massive investigation was absolutely no longer safely confined to just the Clarence House administrative files, but was now aggressively digging deep into the ancient, highly protected revenue streams of the royal estates themselves. Absolutely every dark corner of the royal financial architecture was rapidly being exposed to intense, unyielding judicial scrutiny. So when you step back and look at the absolute whole picture, the massive, glaring contradictions are completely everywhere, destroying the palace's credibility. The palace confidently claimed for years that the painful budget reductions were simply standard, necessary austerity measures, but the leaked internal memos undeniably show highly targeted, malicious cuts directed specifically against William's office, while other favored departments somehow maintained full, uninterrupted funding despite the supposed financial crisis. The palace also confidently claimed that absolutely no one in senior leadership knew anything about the rogue administrative strategies, but the damning signature blocks clearly show the Queen's own private secretary and a highly senior legal advisor were directly, undeniably involved in the plotting, completely destroying the narrative of rogue, low-level employees acting alone. The palace desperately claimed that the damaging leaks were a highly recent security breach, but the evidence proves the external computer terminal used to illicitly access the files actually belonged to a completely defunct advisory board that was officially dissolved way back in 2015, proving this was a long-term, highly sophisticated operation. The government proudly claimed to be fully cooperating with the sovereign, but the records show cabinet ministers were secretly receiving highly sensitive operational updates on royal succession planning entirely behind the king's back, while the Spencer family archive, which supposedly had absolutely no connection to current events, turned out to contain a highly suspicious missing page that someone physically tore out of a notebook, leaving behind a damning indentation that revealed the surname of a former Lord Chancellor deeply involved in the mess. The much deeper, more terrifying implication is that this massive scandal was never just about Camilla or a petty, personal family feud. The recovered documents strongly suggest an incredibly sophisticated, institutional playbook meticulously refined over 30 years, ruthlessly using immense administrative pressure and vast media influence to aggressively manage the succession and control the future of the crown. The massive financial corruption and the highly coordinated narrative manipulation were undeniably funded from the exact same illicit source, proving the people who were explicitly supposed to be managing royal estates were instead actively managing public opinion against the future king. And the absolute only reason any of this incredible corruption came to light is that someone incredibly powerful got incredibly sloppy, leaving pristine photographic copies in a vulnerable flat, and a completely unrelated police raid just happened to accidentally find them. That is absolutely not a brilliantly executed master plan seamlessly coming together. That is a massive, decades-old cover-up spectacularly falling apart in real time, leaving the crown caught hopelessly between the aggressive demands of public accountability and the crushing weight of centuries-old, rigid tradition. William's highly aggressive legal team is moving swiftly through the courts with ruthless precision. A panicked Charles is frantically summoning cabinet secretaries to Windsor Castle. Buckingham Palace remains paralyzed by silence. Clarence House is completely isolated. The aggressive parliamentary inquiry is rapidly expanding its scope, and the furious public is massing outside the gates with handmade signs demanding immediate answers. The ancient institution that successfully survived brutal world wars, shocking abdications, and endless public scandals is now facing something it has absolutely never really had to confront before: a complete catastrophic loss of control over its own highly guarded internal narrative. As the secret documents are out, the private archives are wide open, the financial receipts are on the table, and the one massive thing everyone keeps asking is the simplest, most devastating question of all. Who exactly authorized the massive transfer of duchy funds directly into an external shadowy account, completely without the required legal signatures? Because the ultimate answer to that specific question might be the one massive revelation that finally forces the ancient monarchy to choose definitively between radical, sweeping reform and total, absolute collapse. But there is exactly one more highly fascinating layer that hasn't been fully explored by the press yet, and it deeply involves the highly suspicious timing of Spencer's dramatic appearance itself, as official parliamentary records clearly show that the committee had originally scheduled a completely routine, boring procedural hearing for that specific morning, covering something completely unrelated to royal finances or scandal. Spencer was absolutely not on the official witness list. His recognizable name did not appear on any public agenda, and yet, when he confidently arrived at the strict security checkpoint, his highly restricted parliamentary pass had already been completely pre-authorized through a highly unusual back-channel request filed by an unnamed mysterious clerk in the records office. That unknown clerk had apparently fully processed the security authorization at exactly 6:40 in the morning, hours before the building officially opened for business, and the digital security log shows the pass was printed and waiting at the front desk under a highly specific code that had remarkably not been used since 2019, proving someone highly placed inside Westminster intimately knew Spencer was coming long before Spencer himself had even formally confirmed his travel plans. That undeniable detail means the massive decision to bring the explosive documents forward was absolutely not entirely his own spontaneous choice. The massive leak, the sudden police raid, the highly suspicious pre-authorized pass, the perfect timing of the committee hearing, it all fits together entirely too perfectly, like a highly complex sequence that had been quietly, meticulously assembled far in advance by unseen hands. The absolute only remaining question is whether Spencer was the heroic whistleblower bravely pulling the thread to expose the corruption, or whether someone infinitely more powerful was quietly pulling him like a puppet to achieve a much larger goal, which brings us directly back to the former estate secretary whose modest London flat was suddenly raided by the police. She had remarkably not worked for the royal household at all since 2016, and her highly restrictive employment records show she left under an incredibly strict confidentiality agreement that included a highly specific clause completely preventing her from retaining absolutely any physical copies of any estate correspondence. But the pristine photographic copies found hidden in her desk drawer were absolutely not recent digital prints. Expert forensic analysis definitively dated the photographic paper itself back to 2014, explicitly meaning she had been quietly sitting on those explosive images for well over a decade, while her neighbors described her as highly reclusive, rarely leaving the flat, and consistently paying her expensive rent through a highly unusual third-party account officially registered to an unknown solicitor in Geneva. That specific solicitor's name shockingly appears again in the handwritten margin notes of the 1998 notebooks, absolutely not as a participant in the secret meetings, but rather as an official witness to a completely separate, highly complex financial arrangement involving a massive trust fund established specifically for the maintenance of the Spencer family archives. So, the exact same highly connected legal network that helped quietly preserve the sensitive archive was also directly connected to the specific person who eventually leaked its explosive contents to the police, meaning the entire chain of custody is heavily contaminated by overlapping, highly complex relationships that make it nearly impossible to completely separate fierce family loyalty from massive institutional manipulation. The terrified palace has absolutely not commented on absolutely any of these massive new revelations, and given the immense legal constraints currently binding them, they probably absolutely won't anytime soon. But the deafening silence is absolutely no longer being interpreted by the public as wise, strategic caution. It is being universally read as complete, structural paralysis. Absolutely every single day that passes without a strong official statement allows absolutely another leaked document, absolutely another devastating forensic finding, and absolutely another highly damaging parliamentary leak to completely define the ongoing story, meaning the monarchy has utterly lost the initiative to control its own destiny. And the powerful people who are absolutely now shaping the narrative are absolutely not the ones sitting comfortably in the palace briefing room. They are the aggressive investigators, the meticulous archivists, the relentless researchers, and the fiercely protective family members who decisively decided that the absolute only way to truly protect the ancient institution was to violently expose the corrupt machinery that had been quietly destroying it from within. The ultimate question is absolutely no longer whether the panicked palace can successfully manage the story, but rather, the absolute only question that matters is whether the palace can actually survive the massive story that is completely, undeniably already out there in the world.